Hey, lovely listeners, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. And today I'm joined, it's early for me, but I'm joined by a very special guest who I can't wait to speak with, and I can't wait for you to hear this interview. Nancy, please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to chat with you again. My name is Nancy Schwartzman, and I'm a documentary director. I do feature length docs and series. I focus on generally women driven, women led, and women centered investigation, and sometimes cold cases, sometimes systemic injustice, sometimes both. So I really like to dig around in my documentary work and create stories that highlight, basically the good and the bad surrounding crime situations.
Well, your work is just absolutely incredible and exceptional. And when we last spoke, we talked about Victim Suspect, which is an incredible documentary which really set the world on fire. And what I now know is about all the awards that you won. So I just want to congratulate you and the team because, wow, incredible to win an Emmy. You were nominated for three others for outstanding direction, outstanding investigative documentary, outstanding research, and many other awards as well, which is just incredible. And it is an exceptional piece that really showed what was going on across the country regarding rape, that when women came forward, they were then being seen as the suspect. And it was just so powerful. So, congratulations to you on your incredible work. I mean, if people haven't seen it, please do go and watch Victim Suspect. And of course, we spoke about Roll Red Roll, which is also on Netflix, and that was nominated for a Peabody. So you have such caliber and standing in terms of the work that you do.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear. Appreciate it.
Well, it really chimes with me because a lot of my work is about exactly the same, the investigation, understanding, whatever it might be, what's gone on, giving people space to tell their stories, but also shining a light into the darkest corners and the things that people aren't talking about. And for women, I think that this is just, it's so important, the work that you're doing. And now, of course, we've got your new docu-series, Death in Apartment 603, What Happened to Ellen Greenberg, which premieres on Hulu on September the 29th. So we're talking just a few days before the premiere. I did have the privilege and honor of watching the three-part series. And again, it's a case I know really well. And what you've done is basically show a lot of new information, but also new people are speaking out. And I just wondered, if we could talk about the project, first of all, just for you, whether this project found you or you found it. And the same with Victim Suspects. I'm not sure we got into that, of whether you see these potential for projects and want to dig in, or does someone bring them to you? How do you go about the process to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, just to go over my main projects, Roll Red Roll, I found. I mean, someone pinged me in early days of Twitter and were like, "Whoa, did you hear this story? You need to do something about it." And I'm like, "I need to do something about it." Anderson Cooper's already doing something about it. The news is already covering it, but I looked at the story, you know, it was sort of enough people from the outside had said, "Hey, this feels like something you should look at." And then one conversation with Alex Goddard, who became sort of the protagonist, and I was like hooked in to her. Like it has to be character driven in a way. So Roll Red Roll premiered and did really well on the festival circuit. And then the Center for Investigative Reporting approached me about their research into all of these rape victims being flipped into suspects. So they found me, and the reporter had already done a few years of research and gathering stories and kind of keeping sources warm. So that was my first work for hire. My first film was like this labor of love that was totally driven by me. I had made 3 shorts prior to my feature. Those were all like quirky or personal, they're just like your own thing. Um, and then victim suspect found me, but it was very much in alignment. I did a series after that on Hulu called Sasha Reed and the Midnight Order, which followed this gang of incredible women tracking cold cases and especially using data to better understand serial homicide and victims. And that was something I found. I found those girls kind of, were already a group called the Midnight Order. And, that was like my labor of love there. And then Tricky, another conversation, but Canada doesn't release any of their documents around crimes. So very hard to really investigate as an outsider because Canada's privacy laws are really kind of enable secrecy for what it's worth. And then with this project, with Death in Apartment 603, the producers at Lionsgate approached me about directing it. And it turns out that, I am from Philadelphia. I played tennis. I grew up in going to Manayunk every weekend to play at Arthur Ashe Tennis Center. So everything had happened in this case, like in my backyard. And it felt so close to me. I went to a few different schools, but I ended up graduating from a high school that Sam, Ellen's fiance, went to. So it's just like, wait a minute, this happened in my backyard. And of course, it's about issues that are near and dear to me. Um, but this one found me, but in a way, I feel like I was really perfect for it.
Absolutely. I mean, it being in your backyard and
Yeah.
that proximity. So I wonder, when did you first become aware of Ellen? Was it on your radar before the project kind of finding you again? Do you recall any of it? Because of course the media didn't really report on it. There wasn't that
Right.
much knowledge of what happened to Ellen if we go back a few years.
Yeah, I had not been tracking the case because I left Philadelphia when I was 18 and I never looked back. I moved to New York and then many years later moved to Los Angeles. So I wasn't tracking what was initially kind of a local story. It definitely has blown up since then. But no, I was pretty new to the details of Ellen's case. Yeah.
Yes, I mean,
And
I've
then
been in it for a little while and
yeah.
I've done a series on it because I was aware that there wasn't much media reporting on it. And I have been involved with a number of hidden homicides that are
Mm,
always women, actually. Every case that's
yeah.
been either brought to me or that I've worked on, it's always women. And the pattern of men explaining what happened to them
Mhm.
and the authorities, the police, and others just believing what they're being told and
Yes.
not challenging or questioning it. So I
Yes.
wonder, when you first became aware of some of the details, what was your initial reaction? Can you remember, like, rolling
Yeah.
back to when you heard some of the detail? What sort of stood out to you, and what was, the driving force for you to really want to get into this particular case?
Yeah, I mean, when I first heard about it, I was just so horrified. And the first thing beyond the grisly details of the case, it's also just like getting to know Ellen and understanding who she was. And that felt just core to everything. And the more I learned about Ellen and saw these photos of her and the little bit of video that we have, because it was right before everything was on our phones. So there just isn't a lot of captured video of her. But getting to know her first and foremost was my way in. And I really felt like I could connect to her and that she was very accessible. And, you know, I understood and could imagine what it's like to be, falling in love and thinking you're starting your life and you're 27 and your friends are getting married and it's time for you to get married and sending out the save the dates and all the hope and promise that that is supposed to hold. And then perhaps the feeling that you want to get out of the relationship, you want to go home. This isn't what you thought, but you already sent out the save the dates. all the pressure that comes with wanting to change your mind, being young. You know, we have to remember 27 is still young. We also have to remember in 2011, people were not talking about mental health the way they're talking about it now. They were not talking about healthy relationships. They weren't talking about toxicity in relationships. There wasn't all of that stuff on social media the way it is now. Whether or not it's fully accurate now, at least it's like in the language. So seeing, understanding who she was and the context that she was in, and then learning the extent of the wounding on her body, and then having authorities call it a suicide and everyone lean in to the fact that she, quote, had anxiety or that she had been to a therapist 3 times. I'm like, okay, A plus B does not equal this, okay? Because all of us have been to a therapist a few times. Anxiety does not equal a psychotic break. If that had been self-inflicted, it was so violent. It's 20 stab wounds, 10 in the front, 10 in the back, anatomically highly improbable, impossible, right in the back of the head. So how on earth is this deemed a suicide? And then all of a sudden I felt like we were like shunted back to the Victorian era where someone can just call a woman crazy and do whatever and have the authorities believe it. And it felt very insidious and very dangerous because the precedent, the bar to call something a suicide when it's this questionable should be very, very, very high. You know, and so that was like, whoa, 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 whoa. They're using mental illness against her. Her body tells a very different story. There's also bruising on her body in various stages of healing, which could mean any number of things, but should certainly be looked into very seriously. And we need to be examining all the pieces of her relationship and the people close to her. And in a way, it became another like scrutinize the victim and not really look at the world around her and the surrounding players and asking the right questions of the people in her life that were closest to her, which feels eerily familiar, right, in my work. But yeah, so it's just like all these factors one after the other. And then, you know, what's always inspiring about these really difficult stories is that there are incredible people surrounding the case that want to do good by the victim, that have no skin in the game. Private investigator working pro bono, just he knows right from wrong. Tom Brennan, Guy DeAndrea, former DA in the DA's office, saying, you know, I'm kind of an expert in 911 calls. This one really stopped me in my tracks. You know, her former students coming forward to speak for her, the building manager and the concierge, like people really, this impacted so many people and they all think and deeply in their hearts like this isn't right. We have forensic medical examiners saying, I've seen a lot of suicides before. And stabbing suicides, while they are rare, are not never, but I've never seen it in the back. You know, there's just stuff that just doesn't add up. And it's so cynical to call it a suicide and lean into that and have the authorities just essentially torture the parents in a way. They've just been through hell. When everyone in her life says Ellen was anxious, but she was not suicidal. We know she wouldn't have done this, number one. Number two, Ellen hated pain. She wouldn't even get her ears pierced twice. She would never do this to herself. Yeah.
So many factors actually that you highlight that obviously resonated with you. Similarly with me, as soon as I saw the biomechanics and I looked at the visual of those injuries, you know that 10 stab wounds to the back of the head and the neck, that is atypical. And you had an expert say that. And what I thought you did beautifully was, as you just described, the victimology. Actually, part one, we really do get to know who Ellen was. And that's just so important that we understand her character, her personality, And the photos that I've always seen of her are the ones where she's beaming out. You know, she radiated
Mhm.
energy and joy. And hearing her characterized by her best friend, Alison, and
Mhm.
family members and those who knew her, you brought her to life in a way that hasn't been done before. And I think that that is just so important. Down to the detail you just shared, she didn't like pain. That's
Mhm.
really important when you're looking at a potential suicide slash homicide, whatever
Mhm.
it might be, and seeing so many injuries, but the stab wounds over her clothing, like through
Mhm.
her clothing, which makes it much harder. And we understand from, and spoiler alert, just for people who haven't seen it, because part one really does characterize victimology, and that's such an important part, always getting to know the victim, but the relationship, how the relationship began with Sam. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned, Nancy, taking us back to when we were younger, of
Mhm.
friends getting married, the pressure for you to get married as a woman and wanting to be in love, you know, that sense of seeing friends in this magical space of being in love and wanting that for yourself, wanting to
Yeah.
have a family.
Mhm.
And that can cause us to move in a whirlwind fashion, although this wasn't necessarily a whirlwind relationship with Sam, but we got to know how they got together. And I think
Mhm.
that that's very powerful as well, being set up by friends and meeting
Mhm.
each other on sort of a blind date, and the
Yeah.
romance, the we see text messages that you introduce. So loving messages back and forth, pet names, all of these things that characterize the relationship, and you can understand why they were together. And the perfect match, in some senses, ticking a lot of boxes for
Mhm.
Ellen.
Mhm.
But what you also show is a turning point when things are not going well, when actually before a wedding, the save the date that you mentioned, when she goes shopping for the save the dates, and there's a change in Ellen's demeanor, no longer bubbly,
Mhm.
withdrawn, unhappy, when it should be the happiest time, right? That move into, we're getting married, this is the date, this is, you know, what we're planning. And actually what Ellen's saying is she wants to move and go home and wants to live where her parents live. Well, what
Mhm.
I've always heard about that is it's because the work was too much, the pressure of work. And of course, you have work colleagues, people who worked with Ellen, who talk for the first time that we haven't heard from, saying
Mhm.
that actually there wasn't that much pressure at work. And I think
Yeah.
what most people overlook is that if you've got pressure at work and you don't like your job, I mean, yes, when you're younger, you think your job might be the be all and end all. But if you decide to move across the country or to go back home, that's not just a rejection of the job, that's actually a move away from the relationship. That's
Yeah.
actually at the time when you're meant to be excited about planning your wedding. She was rejecting that by even talking about going home. And that, for me, is where questions should have been asked. I mean, by everybody. She saw the psychiatrist 3 times, and you know, a lot has been made about that. But
Mhm.
we know that when you're younger, that there are a lot of pressures on you, and anxiety does not lead to someone having suicidal ideation. And it was noted
Yeah.
by her psychiatrist, no suicidal
Right.
ideation. So you're
Yeah.
right, that leap of, you know, A to B to get to C, most women know that
Yeah.
you can't make that leap, but men seem to make that determination, in my experience, at scenes like this very quickly. And what you also show in the documentary, and why I say there are spoiler alerts, some things are new, but other things we already know about, and maybe it challenges our view. One new piece of information to me was that the fire department did turn up first of all, and what they actually said from being at the scene was, you don't need an ambulance, you need a homicide detective.
Yeah.
And I
Mhm.
find that amazing that
Mhm.
they walk into the scene and they
Yeah.
see that,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
others walk in, they probably think that, but then they talk to Sam,
Yep.
they change their view.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they walk in, they're like, well, okay, you don't need us here, and then you have a very cooperative, seemingly distressed fiance crying and being cooperative. And you have a very low crime neighborhood. You have a nice, you know, white young man and you trust him, right? You believe it. And, I appreciate what our ADA, Guy DeAndrea says, like, even if you don't know, do you treat the scene as a homicide? Maybe. Yeah. Let's be safe about it. We don't know. We got to talk to everyone. I don't care if this is a nice guy. I don't care if he's cooperating. There's no broken windows. Nobody got in from outside, to our knowledge. And we gotta like look very carefully because yeah, from an outside eye, it's kind of a bloodbath and there's stab wounds everywhere, which is an unusual way to kill yourself, even if it is, um, you know, sometimes happens. It's highly unusual, so it should be investigated. Yes.
Highly unusual,
Mm,
atypical, and you might not see all the injuries when you first go in, but seeing a
right.
knife coming out the chest, I mean, that
Mhm.
visual, because there are crime scene photos, there
Yes.
is video. I mean, that's the
Yes.
first time I'm seeing the scene, which, as somebody who
Right.
assesses scenes, it's really important to have eyes on a scene. And you actually go
Yes.
back to the apartment too,
Yes.
which was so genius to do that, to decide to actually, let's go back to the apartment, let's have a look, let's try and recreate as much as possible, not in a cheap, nasty, recreational way, but
Right.
to go
Yes.
in, to be able
Yes.
to see what some of those items were, i.e., the blueberries, the preparation of the fruit, the knife block being turned over. And I
Yes.
think seeing those things, I mean, certainly for me who assesses scenes,
Mhm.
when we hear people say, oh, well, there was no defensive wounds, there was no struggle. Well, one, I know that there were defensive wounds. And two, I
Mhm.
also know from the knife block being turned over,
Yes.
right, that's a sign of a struggle. Even if
Yeah.
it's just one item that's out of
Yeah.
place like that, that's important to be able to see. So I'm
Yeah.
really glad that you took us in there to be able to also see that when you come through the front door, as Sam
Mhm.
said, he knocked down the front door, you're literally in the kitchen.
Yeah.
It's quite small in terms of a space, isn't it?
Yeah. It's really small. And to go in there and see the focal distance between the door and where Ellen was found is 10 feet and how tight of a space it is. One of our experts, Sarah Klein, who's former law enforcement and assesses scenes, was like, this is a small space. So you're not going to have a huge chaotic fight where paintings are ripped off the wall. You're in this little space and this is what's turned over. And it's the knife block, and being in there, understanding that, her makeup bag, we don't know why her toiletry bag was packed, but it was, and it was on the sink. Um, her scarf was on the sink, her phone was in the bathroom. So it's like bathroom, kitchen, bathroom, kitchen. We know she had her Uggs on. And, again, Ellen is a girly girl. And I don't know about you, I do not wear my city shoes in my house. I cannot imagine. And those were outside Uggs because I saw pictures of her apple picking in them. Those are not her inside slippers. So she has her shoes on. She has a scarf in the bathroom, which tells me you either just took it off or you're putting it on. Like there's a little bit of like gathering my stuff. My outside stuff is here. And, a big question is, was Ellen leaving? Was this the moment when she was getting ready with a full tank of gas, because she had gotten a full tank of gas, um, leave? And you can get a tank of gas because it's a snowstorm, either to prep or not. um there's a lot of, could be this, could be that, but there are also just like full tank of gas, outside shoes, inside, certain bags packed in the area, and then to be in the actual space and know your back is to the door if the door is to open or you open it for someone. What was also important about being in there was hearing from Melissa Ware, the building manager. This whole thing's predicated on Sam being locked out, and that the latch was over the door. And there's eyewitnesses, a neighbor walked by, and Sam made sure, show him, like, I can't get in, I'm locked out. You have a fob that opens the door, but if someone's inside and they put the latch over, you're stuck. So Now, the building manager who knows the building really well and is in this building a lot has been alone in an apartment unit, walked out, slammed the door, and had the latch close. So you can do that to the door yourself. Um, so we don't know. No one was there, obviously, which is another point of interest with Sam when he shouldered his way in or got into the door. Um, but it doesn't mean that, Ellen was necessarily alone only because that door was latched. That can't be the reason why it's a suicide. Like having a door latch, or even, oh, we found something on Ellen's computer. Those two details cannot be the reason why this is a suicide. They're very flimsy. Those are flimsy uh details. That could be many different things. So it's kind of bananas that, law enforcement or the, DA's office would kind of lean and hold on those things.
Absolutely. I can't nod hard enough. I mean, your critical thinking, your open mind of thinking about what are all the possibilities here and looking around an apartment as you describe things being packed up like toiletries, not wearing the engagement ring, pausing to question those things to build your knowledge about what was going on and the timeline. And for the first time, we hear from a neighbour. You had Mark Hemrick's talk about hearing Sam pounding on that door and there being it seemingly an argument and him trying to get in. I just wonder, did Mark say anything about any other arguments that had been heard
Yeah, I
from?
don't know. I mean, no one had said, oh gosh, there's always noise coming from that apartment. I don't think so. I mean, Sam traveled a lot for his job. So they hadn't been together a lot, but nobody talked about that, you know, that it had been a very noisy, though, that couple's always fighting. Nobody said that, right? So that's why that's not included as speculation. Like, we don't speculate. So, Ellen's body had bruises on it, in various stages of healing, which means it was not inflicted on January 11th. They're older. Now she had started some new medication that could certainly cause bruising. Um, that was a very tricky kind of thing to include. Like, we can talk about the bruising, but we can't sort of extrapolate what it is. But there was this idea, you go on crime blogs and someone's like, oh, she could be clumsy. I'm like, I talked to every single one of her friends. She was athletic. She was not clumsy. There's nothing wrong with being clumsy, but nobody described Ellen as clumsy. So I'm not going to include it as a possibility because that's bullshit speculation. Right. So it could be any number of things, but Sam and Ellen in the building were not witnessed fighting, but certainly their friends discussed their dynamic, which was different than Ellen in other relationships. She spent more time with his people, and that this happens, right? You kind of get really tight with him or his family, but she was sort of withdrawing from her old pals a little bit, and there was a bit of a wall up. Like, they couldn't really access what was going on there. And I think it's important that, shame always plays a factor in this stuff when, especially when you really want things to go well and people think they're going well, and maybe they're not.
Absolutely. And not wanting to admit failure in a
Yeah.
relationship. And I think, often having changed the law in coercive control in the UK and working here in Australia, so much of the behaviors are control related, and girls and women don't really think that that is a form of abuse. They don't see
Yeah.
it as anything different. And that's part of the problem, that, often the behaviors are invisible to other people. But I did hear people talk about Sam being very attentive to Ellen in the start of the relationship. Well, attentiveness can also be control related behaviors, and there's a very fine line. And when someone starts to change their behavior, i.e., they're wearing different clothes, they're not socializing with their friends, well, these can all be signs that okay, she's in a new relationship, she's just in love, and that's all normal. But
Right.
what I would like people to think about watching the documentary is to ask more questions of our friends and not allow them to become isolated, because it's very
Yeah.
easy to become isolated and feel that you have no one to talk to when things are going wrong. And that part is just very important when we think
Yeah.
about what does abuse look like, what does behavior look like. You mentioned the various stages of healing with bruising. I mean, for me, that always points to abuse in this
Yeah.
sort of situation. When you look at the history and you're hearing behavioral change, clothing change, isolation, you have to ask more questions about that and not just jump to the conclusion or the assumption, oh, it might be through a sport she's playing. No, she wasn't
Right.
a rugby player, for
No,
example. So
she
you
wasn't.
wouldn't expect to see bruising at various stages of healing. And I think, also one of the things when we go back to you taking us into the apartment,
Hmm.
why I mention you open the door and you're in the kitchen is because that 911 call, which I've taken apart in another episode of the language and what's being said. Well, Sam doesn't say he sees the knife for quite
Right.
a long time into that call, where if you're stood at the doorway, I fail to understand why that wasn't obvious to him. Because as a human being, when you are confronted with something as shocking as that, your brain and it's just within us. We want to make sense of it. We see blood. We're trying to instantly find out where's that blood coming from. And in particular, if we're on a 911 call, we want to be as helpful as possible. But he doesn't talk about the knife until about halfway through. And then he says that, oh my goodness, oh my God, she stabbed herself. She fell on a knife. I mean, that is not the most logical first thought that you would have when you find your fiance with a knife in her chest.
No, no, no. And look, everybody responds to trauma differently, but I have talked to people, unfortunately, who have discovered their loved ones dead, and the first thing they do is run up to them, try to wake them up, like touch them, not keep at a distance, right? There's also that piece. And maybe you're very squeamish about blood and don't want to get close, but not only is it like I didn't see them, I didn't see it, or jumping to a very odd conclusion. Like I'd be afraid if I saw something that bloody that there was a killer in my house. Maybe that's because I'm a woman and, that whatever. I would be terrified that I was in danger also, and something obviously terrible had happened to my person. I wouldn't, yes, and jumping to the conclusion is very strange. Yeah.
It's incredibly strange. And there are all these sorts of anomalies. If you want to
Um,
give help to someone, you
yes.
want to be close to them. And he does talk about going and standing next to her. But the point is that you would visually be able to see her. And you
Yeah.
come in through the door, you can see
Yeah.
via the camera just how close you're literally in that kitchen where she's there. So it's never just one thing in isolation, and I think that's what the docu-series really shows. It digs in through those three parts, into the timeline, the 911 call, which is partly the focus of part two, but also the fact Sam calls his uncle and calls family before he actually calls 911, which again is unusual, because
Mhm.
if you see someone in the state that Ellen was in, your first thought would be medical attention. And that
Yeah.
if you believe they're still alive, you know that minutes count if they're
Yeah.
still alive. So to call a family member is another anomaly. And of course, none of us know how we would react in this sort of
Right.
situation. But what it does is present questions. And
Yeah.
those questions, you don't speculate in the documentary, those questions should have been answered at the very start of this investigation, but unfortunately there wasn't an investigation. And I
Right.
think that also really becomes clear throughout the documentary, that because it was designated a suicide
Right.
at the scene, which again is highly unusual before the autopsy has come back,
Right.
that all the other things, they never happen. There's never any questioning of what's gone on. It's just accepted what Sam says, which any investigator knows that's not how you conduct an investigation. And Guy Dandria, I thought, was brilliant speaking out across the documentary.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think another, interesting piece that in context is really compelling are those last text messages Sam sent to Ellen. If you're worried about someone A being suicidal, perhaps you would have had different language in your text messages. I'm worried about you. You're locked out. I'm locked out. What's going on? I'm worried. Did you fall in the shower? But the text messages seem to point as an argument that's kind of escalating. Like there's a lot of anger in them. There's a lot of exclamation points. There's cursing. It's like you better have an excuse. Um, you know, that just feels like language. It's if you're truly concerned about someone's well-being, it's not reflected in those text messages.
I agree. And that context is very important. If, because he said to the police, she has mental health issues, she's seen a
Right.
psychiatrist, she's on medication, he volunteers that at the scene, but you see no care in those text messages about what's happening for her if there was genuine concern that her mental health was a problem. And the other part to that is we hear from obviously Sandee and Josh, but her friends. If he was
Mhm.
so worried about her mental health, why wasn't he
Right.
contacting friends and family to say, hey, I'm worried about Ellen. We need to support her and make an intervention. And I want us all to do it. He's meant to be the fiancé who cares and loves for Ellen. And with
Yeah.
my work, often it's not about what's present, it's about what's absent.
Mm.
And that's what's absent if we are to believe his narrative that there is
Right.
concern for her mental health. You wouldn't expect to see, it was almost like a threat. You better have a good reason,
Mhm.
the good excuse. I mean, if someone's talking to you like that, and then I don't know about baseline, I saw the text messages that we see in the documentary when it was all lovey-dovey. And
Yeah.
then, it's very difficult. We've got two very different, the lovey-dovey romantic, and then obviously things change, and not knowing what messages are passing between them, because obviously her phone was taken out of the scene the next
Mhm.
day, her phone, her laptop. So we've got a problem around the chain of evidence, which is also
Mhm.
important, isn't it? Because I don't want
Yeah.
to give too many spoilers, but you do
Right.
show in the docu-series
Yeah.
towards the end that there are these web searches that the governor heavily emphasizes, these web searches about painless suicide, committing suicide, which Guy Dandria, I think, is very compelling when he says, well, I've seen the case files, I've seen
Mhm.
everything that exists on the case, and I never saw that. So
Right.
now we've got a question mark. Well, where do these web searches fit in? Where do they come from? And
Mhm.
equally for me, assessing everything, and I'm sure this was on your radar,
Mhm.
well, the way she died wasn't painless. It was the
No.
exact opposite of that. It's not even congruent or salient that why would she do these searches and then end her life in one of the most painful ways possible?
Yeah. I mean, it's very strange. And I think the chain of custody with the technology is so clearly violated, which doesn't mean that the tech can't be investigated in a forensic manner, because it can. It just has to be in the hands of the right people who will be able to see if within the window of when the technology was removed, if other things were removed or added, and what has changed throughout. It can be done. So even if the chain of custody was broken, the technology can still be analyzed. However, in the first pass, the FBI says there's nothing unusual on these devices, pointing to suicide. So, that raises a lot of questions. And again, to hinge suicide on a door latch, which, if you go on YouTube, you can see these doors open and close from outside, both sides. And questionable web searches when the chain of custody of the devices was broken. So those two things, and apparently the scene wasn't disturbed, which is not true. And that, someone witnessed Sam breaking down the door, which we absolutely know that's a bit of a spoiler, but anyway, was not true. So beyond that, the door latch and the chain of custody with the technology are used as these, irrefutable things that override everything else to keep it a suicide. And that just doesn't make sense anymore. All the evidence is out now. Perhaps that made sense to whomever, 10 years ago before this stuff was all public, but now, I don't normally, I mean, my work. I wouldn't normally include crime scene photos. It is important to look at the scene. I wouldn't normally include photos of a victim's body. If this is a open and closed case, let's say Sasha Reed in the Midnight Order, we look at Robert Pickton. He was convicted of killing. He was accused of 49, convicted of 6. We don't show those crime scenes. It's shut. It's closed. We actually talk to the family. We get a sense of the victimology because those victims were completely discarded. But there's no question of what happened, right? And so in this case, because there's a question, because law enforcement and the city is saying it's a suicide, it felt really important that we see what that scene looked like, we see the amount of blood, and we see the wounding on her body. I mean, normally, like I would not, you want to protect the privacy of the victim, but I think audiences and people need to see this because common sense will prevail when you look at that imagery, and that's the point of it. And the family understands why it did that also.
Yes, and I totally understand why you made those choices. And it's not done in a gratuitous or sensationalist way, but it is a very important thing for people to see because that's what Sam was confronted with. And therefore, for me, seeing the proximity, for example, that was so important to understand. And hearing Tom Brennan talk through that she had been moved, her body had been moved. We can tell these things through the blood and various other things. So I thought it was done in the right way. And I'm sure Josh and Sandee, what you really bring out, and I mean, kudos to them for having to fight and fight and fight for the most basic things to be done. But for them having to go to the media in the first place, it really comes out that that wasn't what they wanted to do. They tried to exhaust every avenue to get the right outcome, i.e. a proper investigation, and they're still having to push and push and push. So I hope the documentary really does change things for them because the case was back in court September the 3rd, even though the two lawsuits have been settled. And that's what I mean. The family have had to take out lawsuits against the city of Philadelphia and the medical examiner, Dr. Osborne, and the police officer, John McNamee, and also Dr. Galino. They've had to really press so hard. It should not be this difficult. And even now, even though those lawsuits were settled, even now they still have not got an investigative outcome from the re-examination of the case. And Judge Linda Carpenter said that, and I'm going to quote her, she said, "It's ridiculous and you obviously don't care. And that's probably why the Greenbergs are so frustrated, because if the city cared, expedited means a week or 10 days. So she's talking back to the lawsuits being settled and the agreement to review the case. And she said, now so much time has gone by, how will the family have faith that it was done fairly? And justice delayed is justice denied." And she even threatened to bring the case back to trial for breach of the settlement, and then an agreement is reached, and they've got until October the 14th. So even now, there's still a fight.
Still waiting. Yeah. Yeah, it's so unfair. They settled with the city on February 3rd. They were told that they would get an expeditious reexamination. Now, the family's wary because the reexamination is happening within the same department that designated it a suicide in the same city. So that would make anyone concerned that it's, oh, we're going to look into it. And it's the same folks who called it a suicide 14 years ago. But however, 9 months later, and there was no movement on it, which is so insulting. It's really insulting to the family. The city made an agreement and they didn't keep their word, and the judge was angry about it. Justice delayed is justice denied. That's not right. The expeditious is slightly open-ended. Is it a week? Is it a month? It is not 9 months. And that is outrageous. So we're all, well, Josh and Sandee are on different, polls, but I think we're cautiously optimistic that whatever the answer will be a big deal in whatever direction.
I mean, hearing a judge say those things, that's very unusual, that she
Yeah,
really ripped the city, didn't she? And
she did.
no, well needed and interesting. It's a female judge that,
Yeah,
really ripped into them. And I think, having Joe Pedraza in the
yes,
documentary as well. I mean, again, another stand-up person who's doing this
yeah,
for the right reasons, who just wants to help. And that really came out, that Tom Brennan, everyone who's involved in the case,
yeah,
really want to help and want to ensure that Ellen is honoured and that there is a thorough investigation here. And that the last part 3, is about the
yeah,
Greenbergs versus the city of Philadelphia. So we
yeah,
get much more into the legal parts of this fight. But I thought what really stood out is the release of the surveillance cameras, as you mentioned. So spoiler alert, I have talked about this on Crime Analyst, but the fact that you have Phil Hanton, the concierge, and we see the visual, we see the video ourselves, that he did not go with Sam. And although there's not cameras actually on the door, he
hallway.
didn't get into
Yeah,
the elevator, as Sam said.
nope.
So it raises that question about why he said that someone was with him when he, in inverted commas, broke down that door. And hearing how it affected Phil Hanton, him saying that he
Yeah,
saw Ellen, week before, she was bubbly, she was happy, and you can hear just how this has affected him. And he can't make that leap about what happened, and he's talking out because
yeah.
of it. But Joe had to fight to get that
Oh
surveillance
yeah,
footage. That was
oh
another
yeah.
fight where the city said that it
Ridiculous.
didn't exist, even though they have 12 to 20, there were 12 to 20 cameras in the
Yeah,
building. So you have the building manager talk, but hearing that Joe requested that footage and they said categorically there's no evidence, it doesn't exist, and then had to threaten with court action, and then, oh, you mean this footage, and then it's released.
just so infuriating. And it's so infuriating. And I love that, Joe is a great storyteller, and that really comes alive, how important that footage is, and how, you know, they obviously had it. Now they don't release the hours before and the hours after. That'd be helpful. Right? Who else came in? I would love to see Ellen coming home that day. I would love to see Sam coming home. Who else came? Yeah, so just to also make a little clarification in terms of the police report says Sam was accompanied. We don't know if Sam said that or if the police, because good Lord, we all know there are mistakes all over police reports. So we don't know if they made that mistake or Sam told them. So just to be clear, that's unclear. It's just on the police report incorrectly. That late release of video footage, it really reminded me of Victim Suspect, when the Tuscaloosa Police Department said they had this really incriminating video against one of the victims, and this is why she was lying, and all this crap. And then we emailed them right before, said, okay, this film's going to be on Netflix. So if you do have that incriminating video, please share it, after years of trying to get it. And then they released the video. And it's absolutely not incriminating at all. It's exactly what, it's different. Like, that video is not incriminating, and I would say the lobby video in Death in Apartment 603 is calls into question a lot of things.
It does, and that's what you have to do. You have to ask questions about what's going on, and law enforcement know that. Whether there's a
Yeah.
northeastern storm coming in or not, a woman died in a brutal and violent way, and we have to remember that to honor Ellen, she deserved questions and the right
Yeah.
questions to be asked. And that is an interesting distinction you make on the police report, that's what was written. Having worked in the police, it really matters, the words that you use. If you're the one making that assumption, that needs to be clear. But if somebody told you that needs to be stated. i.e., if Sam said, I spoke to the concierge, he came with me. And that was such a big part of this, that it was a
Yeah.
locked door case.
Right.
And in fact, from talking to Gavin Fish, because he was one of the people who I spoke with, he had a lot of the documents in Ellen's case because they'd been given to him. And he actually did a test using a similar lock on a
Mhm.
door to see
Mhm.
if you used force, what that would look like, how much force would be needed. And it's always a question in my mind that we see those sorts of latches on hotel doors, for example,
Mhm.
that you could, shut the door yourself and the latch locks, but also some of them you can open from the outside. And
Yeah.
the latch wasn't really busted off and you show that footage as well, where that latch isn't
Yeah.
actually totally forced and broken off
No.
of the wood. It
Mhm.
is, there's clearly been some pressure applied, but
Mhm.
again, a lot was made of that by law
Right.
enforcement and by Dr. Osborne. And that
Yeah.
meeting that was the secret meeting that you really draw out, that the secret meeting between the police and the medical examiners. And he had originally determined that it was homicide. He comes out of that meeting and changes that determination. And they all say they had no notes of that meeting, which I found jaw dropping because having worked in law enforcement, even back in the day, I was always told by my boss, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And one day
Right.
you may have to account for why you did A, B, or C. And if there's no records, a lawyer will question you on that and it just doesn't exist. And it's interesting, they all stuck to there were no notes, but yet such an important decision was made. And we have to, well, we're being told it's undocumented. And they
Right.
can't even remember when it's such an important decision, which I found quite unbelievable, actually.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I also just want to make sure, the role of journalism is really highlighted here. The family got no answers, got no support from institutions, and eventually, went to someone who had covered the case early on, Stephanie Farr, at the Philadelphia Inquirer, who was not necessarily an investigative reporter. She did the crime beat, but she wasn't in the investigation department. And she sort of did that as her, this became her passion. She had her daily beat. And then in a, for a year, did a really incredible investigation that really helped put this case on the map, got all the documents, did all the FOIAs that became public because she requested them as a journalist. So a lot of the stuff on blogs and stuff is from her hard work as a journalist, making sure that stuff is answered for or found, right? So the family had no other choice. And so I really want to honor also that these stories matter, and being able to verify them, with court documents or discovery or public records, even if they're begrudgingly made public, is how we can hold institutions and those in power to account. And, she really put that in motion and enabled Joe Pedraza to get involved and file the lawsuit.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Stephanie. I
Yeah.
thought she was exceptional in the
Yeah.
documentary of
Yeah.
describing the journey. And I didn't know that she wasn't an investigative
No.
reporter because the way that she comes across, I mean, of course, we're hearing from her now, but her understanding that things just weren't right. And one of the things she said was that it was highly unusual for the police department to publicly contradict the
Yeah.
medical examiner's determination of manner of death. Highly unusual, yes. I mean, this doesn't happen. It's not their job and it's not their area of expertise, but it gave her the curiosity to keep asking questions. She's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, she's fantastic and very no nonsense, and just really did an incredible job, and was the imprint of getting this case into the public consciousness and enabling a lawsuit, right? And then enabling global media attention, right? So it's really incredible how the chain of events worked. And we wanted to show that in the series because there's so many twists and turns to the case. There's so many kind of riveting pieces of evidence. And then it's like, wait, how did this all unfold? who are the people who enabled. So every interview we did, we had to get each person to tell the story from start to finish from their perspective and their participation. So it's so, every single person that we interviewed walks us through kind of their lane and their role. And the time was so tight. I would have loved to spend hours with each of them I love the personal. I want to know about your feelings too. And there wasn't like tons of time for that, but luckily people were so passionate that their contribution showed their feelings. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, that really comes across. And I was going to ask you, how easy was it to get people to talk? But I think you've answered that question, that this is a case that has stayed with people and they really want to see it resolved for the right reasons. And so
I
it
mean, there's a
sounds
lot of
like,
people who wouldn't talk. And you'll read all of them in the end cards. Police wouldn't talk, medical examiner wouldn't talk, attorney general's office wouldn't talk, DA wouldn't talk, governor's office wouldn't talk, Sam Goldberg wouldn't talk. So there's a lot. There's a lot of people who wanted to, and then there's a lot of people who didn't.
yes, well, that speaks volumes as well, in a
Hmm.
sense. And
Yeah.
interestingly, that many of the professionals that questions are
Hmm.
being asked of now did not want to go on the record. And my last question to you: what's your hope for the documentary? I think it's going to have a huge impact because not many people know the case, and the way that you've put it together, part one, two, and three, it's so gripping, and
Mm.
you do want more. I mean, I know the case well. I learned so many new things from watching it, and the way that you have put it together, it is like this reinvestigation,
Mm.
the investigation that never was, right?
Mm.
And you're not
Mm.
leading people down a certain pathway, you're leading things open. But what's your hope, Nancy? I mean, you're executive producer, showrunner, you've done many of these projects. Where would you like to see this go in terms of your work in the documentary, or the series, I
I
should
mean,
say?
this was really beautifully timed in a lot of ways. It's just such a huge battle for the family, and so many people contributed on the film side even before I showed up. Really dedicated producers, keeping sources warm, adding energy, just like holding and making sure we could do the project. And my first day of filming was in City Hall on February 3rd, was the settlement. So after years of nothing, suddenly we have a court date, February 3rd. And then after years of waiting, we're going to have some kind of outcome in 2 weeks on October 14th, and our series drops on Monday. So it's just like, this is really well timed, I think, to put Ellen's story out there and put everybody involved on watch and institutions. And this is not a crackerjack escapade here. We have, everything from court documents to autopsy file. This is all evidence and verifiable and verified. So we are telling the story, laying out the facts, and I think a lot of people are gonna want to know what happens, and it's not going to be acceptable if it's reclassified as a suicide.
Absolutely,
So,
particularly now the medical examiner has reneged and
yeah,
said that it must be classified as something other than suicide.
right,
Therefore, he is the one that can say either way. But as the judge said, it's just unbelievable that they can't reclassify it and move on with the investigation. There's something else going on behind the scenes, which is why we need more eyeballs on it, and
right.
why you've done such an important piece of work, which hopefully will create pressure. And I hope these people, those involved, the police department, the governor's office, I really hope that they do the right thing and they honour Ellen, because my
Yeah,
goodness, Josh and Sandee, the journey they've been on, no parent should
no,
have to go through
no,
this. And it was very
no.
profound when they said, they want to be on this planet still and see their daughter, her being done right and getting justice. And they're obviously very conscious of years ticking by in their age, and they shouldn't have to spend their whole retirement just trying to get the basics done for their daughter. And Ellen could be any one of us, right? I mean, we go back to your locus on it. You're local to the area. That's where you grew up. I'm sure that there was a part of you that knew it could be any one of us, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I think so many of the women on this team really relate to Ellen and feel like they could have known her. Or she could have been a family member, friend, or, some of the men on the team who are really amazing editors have daughters. And I think that's why a lot of heart comes through the episodes as well, is we had parents on it, imagining their precious daughters being taken away. So I think all of us were really emotionally invested in the story, whether from, as parents, as daughters, as only children, as someone who friends, and all of us, the Fanning sisters were really passionate about it. It's the kind of thing that you just know in your heart is not right. Yeah.
And you've done the right thing here, Nancy. If you're not trying to change the world, then what's the point? And your work really does move the needle and change the world, and it matters to women. So I want to thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done. And I hope for Josh and Sandee, we do see the right outcome in Ellen's case to honor her. Thank you for talking with me. Thank you for your important docuseries.
Oh, thanks, Laura. That's very, very kind. Appreciate it.
And to all my lovely lot who are watching this or listening to it, please do watch the series. It premieres September the 29th on Hulu, 3 parts, and use your voice, be an activist, write to those who can create change, create momentum, let people know, the family know. There's a Justice for Ellen Facebook page, that Ellen matters and we care about her, and we're not going to stop until the right outcome. So remember, my lovely listeners, to always be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.